Hey folks, welcome back. Hope you're doing well out there. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you a model that I created for myself that I found to be very, very helpful. And this is really a model to help you better understand the kind of bigger picture of your healing process. So this might be to help you understand what things might be missing in your healing process that you need. This might be a tool to help you reconcile an understanding of how these different kind of techniques all fit together and work together. And in general, this just starts to help us understand what a well-rounded, transformational personal development, healing, mental wellness path looks like. So if that interests you, please join me. Okay, so a little bit of context here, and then we'll go ahead and look at the model and talk about it. So the model that I'm going to share with you today is what's called the Directions of Work model. This is a model that I made really just personally for myself to organize my understanding of all the different things that I've been studying and learning. So, when we start to look at spiritual practices and classic personal development, like Tony Robbins style personal development stuff, and we start to look at, different therapeutic techniques, and we start to look at psychedelic therapy, and we start to look at, understanding all these different layers and aspects of a human being and all these different approaches to working with people, it can really get overwhelming, right? I've studied so many modalities at this point that it can be a lot of information to kind of organize an understanding of. And I started to think about it, as I often do, and this understanding of really how to organize all these different sets of whole schools of thought, right? So what's the master map here of how to plot and organize all these different approaches so that I know when to use what for what issue, for what person, for what situation. And so that I also know perhaps where I need to develop my skills more as a coach or as a hypnotherapist, or in my own life, I can start to look at where are the places that are perhaps a little deficient for me that I need to strengthen, or where am I spending a lot of time where I perhaps want to move into a different place to create a more well-rounded, holistic, balanced approach myself. So what I'm saying here is this map kind of spontaneously emerged. This is one of these ideas that just kind of popped into my brain from my unconscious mind. And I was like, wow, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That really works. And kind of put it down, shared it with some peers to, really positive reviews and results. And so I thought I would share it here with you. This is a tool that I think I'm going to start bringing into the channel more, talking more about as a reference point. And I wanted to, just kind of show you this map so you start to understand perhaps your own path and what it is that you need to, add or change, or, kind of understanding the larger picture of the kind of work you're doing right now, whether that's, personal growth work and optimizing yourself, or spiritual work, or again, healing work of some sort. And I also want to just talk about some of the common kind of examples from the world around us, especially if we're looking at the kind of personal development and psychedelic therapy spaces, and perhaps where they fall into this kind of model or this map of understanding. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at it and start talking about it here. Again, I just really want to share this map with you, help you get a big picture view of perhaps, what you need to heal or grow, what's missing, what's working, that kind of a thing, and start to talk about some of the common, things we see in the world and how they fit into this model. So let's look at it. Okay, so first things first, this is the Directions of Work model. It looks very simple, but as we start to talk about it and as you start to add information into it, you can start to really use this to sort out, again, a big picture understanding of perhaps what's missing in your approach, where the center of gravity tends to be for you, et cetera, right? So this can become very nuanced and very useful and detailed, but let's just start with the basics here. So obviously what we're looking at here is just an XY graph, essentially, or four directional kind of map of things, again, as a big picture, right? So if we can imagine at the center of this cross here, this is kind of the default state of consciousness that your average human being, your status quo, total baseline, run-of-the-mill, stock human being kind of lives at, right? So generally speaking, if we are totally normal and average in every way, we are kind of sitting perhaps somewhere towards the center of things here, right? Now, this is our default everyday consciousness, the default mode, if you want to think of it that way from a psychedelic therapy perspective or a neuroscience perspective. And generally speaking, our attention kind of moves in one of these four ways. I'll give more context as we go on into this, but just to understand the model really briefly, for a lot of people, if we start to get upset, our attention starts to move towards the problem, right? Towards the issue. And this is where we get rumination, really focusing on what's wrong, really noticing everything that is problematic, triggers, upsets, processing, this kind of a thing. That's all here in the gravity towards the problem, or the attention towards the problem, if you want to think of it that way. If we start to develop more positive emotion, positive mindsets, more sense of well-being, connectedness, joy, thriving, empowerment, self-trust, these kinds of things, right? Then we move towards the resource. So what we mean in this case with resource are resource states. So again, these are positive emotions, positive mindsets, empowering mindsets, anything that starts to resource you to feel capable of adapting and meeting life, right? So towards the problem, towards the resource. Then for a lot of people, that's kind of really where day-to-day life is lived, is kind of swinging back and forth between resources and problems, and kind of, let's say, the percentage between negative emotion and positive emotion. And that's where a lot of people's attention is in terms of their life experience. But there's a whole other axis here, as you can see, that for a lot of us, again, if we're kind of living in the middle, we may not be too aware of the extremes, right? So at one extreme, we have the transpersonal, right? So transpersonal is kind of a fancy way of saying the transcendent, the spiritual, the non-dual, the connective, the wholeness of life, right? So as human beings, surely if you're watching this channel, you're already well aware that we are highly capable of having transpersonal experiences, that we can indeed move into a spiritual experience or a deeper experience of the wholeness of life. And that's really what this level of consciousness or this type of attention is, right? So the attention of that which transcends the personal and egoic sense of self. Again, at center, you're at basic standard ego function, right? If we go down and we look at, sub aspects of ego function, we move down into parts, right? So this is where you see parts work. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the idea of IFS, or internal family systems, and parts work. It's a very popular topic right now in the trauma therapy space, also in the psychedelic therapy space. So you've probably heard about IFS and parts work. And we can look at it also just in terms of parts of our own experience, aspects of our memory, aspects of our personality. You could also think of this in terms of like more broadly parts, but like the Jungian idea of, or the Freudian idea even of, the ego, superego, the id, or, the persona, the identity, the shadow, these kinds of things. So parts is a sub-identification of aspects of self, we could say, whether those are big aspects of self or small detailed aspects of self, right? So really, we want to start to look at our process here and our sense of who we are in terms of these four directions, right? Where do we tend to spend a lot of time? Towards the problem, in a resource state, in a transpersonal kind of consciousness, a spiritual awareness, or looking at, sub parts of our psyche and really figuring out the little details of different aspects of our experience. This starts to give us a roadmap of knowing perhaps where we are, and perhaps, again, where we need to move our attention or our nervous system, if you want to think of it that way, or what interventions might be helpful, or what areas of our life we might need to develop. So I hope this is starting to make a little sense here. So this is the four directions of work. And again, just to, remind you what I just said a little while ago, this is something I developed to organize my own understanding of all these different modalities and approaches to working with people, because they do kind of spread across these four different approaches. Some modalities when it comes to working with people are very problem focused, very problem centric. Others are very parts centric, right? Down into the sub details of your experience. Others are really resource centric in terms of developing a more robust set of internal resources and self-concept. And then, others are more transpersonal. It's more about just direct spiritual experience and how that impacts your understanding of yourself and life, right? So this is the map and the model. Let's talk about some of the specific examples though. Okay, so let's take the recent example of the course that I just put out last week, the Guided Mystical Experience, which is explicitly a course organized around helping you to have a psychedelic experience that delivers a mystical experience, right? So this is all about the transpersonal and really resourcing you, not just having a neutral transpersonal experience, but having an incredibly life affirming, healing, liberating, positive one, right? So, in the case of that kind of work, of deep spiritual work, of transcendent work, of non duality, we're really looking, at very least putting someone here in the transpersonal. But more likely, when we're talking psychedelics and we're talking about liberation from suffering and these kinds of spiritual ideas, really we're looking at putting someone over here where they are both beyond their ego, beyond their standard persona and identity, and feeling deeply resourced, right? So just as an example, so this starts to help you understand, okay, in the course of, using psychedelics therapeutically for healing, these kinds of experiences are obviously probably going to be really useful and important to feel outside of, beyond yourself, and feel really good and really connected and really resourced. But you might also need, of course, things that are, down here that are resourcing of your parts, right? Or you may need to spend some time down here, between parts and the problem, or move between parts and the transpersonal, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So there may be other things you need on this path besides strictly a transpersonal peak experience, but obviously we still need to have maps and models of how to have peak experiences. And I would say as part of your overall path, definitely you want to have a peak experience at some point. In fact, you probably want a bunch in your kind of memory bank, if you want to think of it that way, or your repertoire, if you want to think of it that way, so that you can absolutely draw from that inner knowing of what transcendence and deep well-being feels like. So that's just one example. Okay, but let's look at some other examples here. So now that you understand a bit of what I mean in terms of how to map stuff onto this, let's look at some more kind of standard examples of what you may have already experienced or done along your path of personal growth and personal healing, right? So first one I'd like to use as an example here would be, say, standard talk therapy, right? So obviously, standard talk therapy has a certain approach and a certain focus and a certain bias, right? And that bias, generally speaking, is a framing or a underlying orientation towards pathology, towards problems, towards issues, towards that which is not healthy or that which is not working, right? And this is a real problem in the therapy field, that your kind of garden variety standard therapist is very pathology focused, right? And pathology literate with all their own maps and models. So that's going to put your average, standard therapist somewhere over here in the towards the problem area, right? And a lot of therapists, and this is really the problem with a lot of standard talk therapy, is they spend all their time just focusing on things through the lens of problems, issues, and negative emotions and, behavioral deficiencies, right? So often therapists, if they're kind of, not well-rounded or well-trained, may not know how to really get you into a resource state or help you develop resources all that well. Some will, some won't. It really depends. But the whole, approach of working with resources first is something that generally your standard therapist is not very well versed in and is going to be totally lost about how to do, right? And maybe, this becomes a problem for people if, let's say, for example, you are really struggling to access the problem or feel comfortable going there yet. And you need a sense of hope and a sense of optimism and a sense of feeling resourced enough to even deal with the problem, right? Maybe you need to go to the resource first. What happens in that case if the therapist is already only biased towards the problem? Another example with talk therapy is, a lot of talk therapy lacks a truly, conceptual framework for the transpersonal, right? So I'm sure some of you have probably heard of transpersonal psychology, which is a whole other field that kind of grew out of the obvious observation that psychology and therapy was very limited in its ability to address questions, needs, issues, and experiences that really exist as part of human experience, but beyond the personal, right? Where it becomes collective problems or transpersonal, transcendent experiences that are beyond the identity and the personal narrative, right? So this is another way that standard therapy kind of tends to underserve us, right? This is, for example, CBT is not going to offer you a lot in terms of transpersonal experiences, right? Another, way that this often goes, again, is that therapists, if we're talking standard psychodynamic therapy, kind of Freudian in its root and in its base, may not really have a really good map or understanding of how to work with parts or even identify that there are parts. I talk to therapists all the time. I'm always learning from therapists, talking shop with therapists, co-learning. And, I've certainly bumped into therapists along the way who don't really have a very good working model or understanding of parts of the personality or the identity or the psyche, however you want to think of that. And so again, if this is all the therapist has to work with, then you're kind of stuck in one particular approach, which could be really useful if all you want to do is focus on the problems with this particular therapist and they're highly skilled and trained and you have a good connection and it's a good fit. Don't get me wrong, there's still value here, but there is a real limitation in worldview if all we're seeing is problems. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about things from an IFS or internal family systems perspective. Really quick, I'll say before I kind of make my points here, if you're not familiar with IFS and internal family systems, it's just a very popular new approach to therapy that recognizes that our personality isn't one just contiguous thing, that we actually have parts or sides to our personality. You could almost think of them as small subpersonalities, that often these parts of our personality have developed in response to trauma, difficult situations, challenges, stressors in life, and that often these parts are the source of some of the, let's say they hold some of the suffering or the pain or the fear or the stress that is driving perhaps some of our dysfunctional behavior. Right. So that's kind of the quick TLDR on IFS. So IFS is explicitly a framework of therapy that is organized around the idea of parts. So IFS is very much down here. And often IFS is kind of parts and problems. So we're kind of down in this kind of area here where we are processing problems through the worldview or the lens of understanding parts. To be fair, sometimes parts, end up, we discover resource parts. So we can end up over here, right? Or we can end up processing an issue, a problem from a part and, and then that kind of integrates in some way and we end up more resourced about a part. The other thing I would like to say is, of course, from an IFS parts perspective, part of what makes IFS work and our ability to work with parts work is some accessing of a transpersonal experience. Let's say not a fully transpersonal experience where you're, beyond your body and beyond your identity altogether and some like deep, oneness, samadhi with the universe kind of thing, but somewhere probably around here where you're a bit dissociated from your standard identity into a more broad observer mindfulness state that enables you to be able to work with parts. So IFS is very much kind of parts and whole, kind of back and forth. accessing this sense of what they call self energy in order to be able to work with parts. So this gives us a very clear understanding of, the role of parts and of IFS. But, what I notice a lot is people who get really into IFS get really into only seeing parts. And they get really into kind of ruminating and over fixating on this part feels this way and that part feels that way. And this part came up with this memory or came up with this metaphor and that story. And we get really into, especially if we have issues we're working through, trauma we're working on, we end up over focusing on parts. We end up over focusing on the specifics of different emotions. I think almost with an expectation that there's going to be no negative emotion. This is something I see a lot with my clients where they get so hyperfixated on parts and the relationships between parts that they really lose a sense of their wholeness and their kind of deep connection to life. And so often what I find is if this is you and you're kind of neurotically chewing on parts and ruminating, or you're kind of over here and parts and problems, that you really want to, sometimes the move here is to really go deep into the transpersonal for a while, have like a deep meditation experience, go do a Vipassana retreat for, 5 days or 7 days or 10 days, perhaps take psychedelics if you take them, and, something like that, even just a few moments of stepping into your transpersonal self, or even over here into the transpersonal resource, and then reflect back on these parts and these specifics of what you're going through and the different aspects of your identity and your history and who you are and the different layers of emotion and meaning for you from this view of being kind of bird's eye, of being expanded, of being in your deep wholeness, we could call it. And then this really creates a very different sense of what's going on with our parts. And often this creates a lot of the relief that we need to be able to, effectively work with parts and help find resolution. So if you find yourself overly focused on parts, perhaps one of the moves here is to move towards the transpersonal and start to integrate some sort of a transpersonal practice into your, growth practice or your therapy or your healing path here. And with the transpersonal, you can start to, again, create more understanding, more of a balanced view, more of a truly integrated understanding of yourself. So that's an example of how this starts to map out, perhaps what we need to do and where IFS falls in this. Okay, so what about from a spiritual lens, right? What about people who are really into this idea of energy work and, transmuting issues, or kind of Buddhist and Hindu practices that are all about transcending the ego for liberation and liberation causing the removal of suffering? Where does that fit? So obviously, a spiritual approach is going to put us way up here in the transpersonal, right? Now, there's interesting thoughts about this, right? So if we're looking at spirituality as a tool for relieving suffering or for emotional healing or for bringing peace into ourselves, which oddly enough is a very common way of conceiving of spiritual practice. I think this has a lot to do with Buddhism and the idea of the cessation of suffering. But it's clearly a theme in people who practice a lot of different spiritual traditions, that they're going to the spiritual to try to address rather some sort of a personal pain, issue, fear, need, something that needs healing, honestly, right? So obviously what we see up here is people who, again, want to just kind of move beyond the default state of consciousness up into the transpersonal. And the assumption is, once I really establish myself here permanently in the transpersonal, then it's all going to be all good and I'm not going to suffer anymore, right? But in my experience, this is a very flawed conception. This is a very flawed expectation to have, right? So if we're only up in the transpersonal, obviously we can very much, because we're transcending the personal and the identity and the core, set of experiences and memories and feelings and the minutia of our experience, we're going to totally be abandoning parts, which means that any pain, any suffering, any fear, any stuckness, issues, unresolved questions that parts of our identity may have are not getting any connection, any attention. They're just simply abandoned. They're just simply not being met at all, right? If we go to the transpersonal, again, then we are moving kind of away from the problem, unless we end up in transpersonal problems, and that's kind of collective shadow territory, right? But if we go to the transpersonal, then we are perhaps not addressing that there is a problem, or we are perhaps not able to effectively reach into what the problem is, because our assumption is that abandoning the identity structure, the ego structure, is somehow going to do all the fixing, do all the healing, do all the solving. I've been really clear, I think, on this channel, and I'm sure I'll say it a cajillion times more, and definitely on Reddit also, that I've run that experiment myself for a long time. I've spent a lot of time in the transpersonal, and I still had the problems. I still had my trauma triggers. I still had my trauma behaviors. I still had my dysfunctions. I still had my low functioning. And so for me, and for a lot of people that I've met who have tried a similar approach, just going the transpersonal doesn't really work, right? The transpersonal often, if you move into the transpersonal, will actually kind of shoot you more again into this transpersonal resource place where you're feeling perhaps oneness with all of life, and this gives a sense of compassion or a sense of love or a sense of wholeness or a sense of bliss and ecstasy or hope or strength, right? So there's a lot of beauty that comes from kind of this area of the map here. But the transpersonal in and of itself, if you're going strictly transpersonal, can also be kind of very neutral, actually. And these bliss states and these resource states and these positive emotions and positive affects can be considered kind of fleeting, transitory identity phenomena as well. And you're just kind of in this like impartial witness state where, sure, bliss can happen sometimes, but then it goes away. Sure, deep transpersonal suffering arises, but then it goes away. And you're just kind of in this kind of non-state of awareness, of pure awareness, if you want to think of it that way. So I do think, again, transpersonal is on the map for a reason. It's an important part of the territory here. But in my experience, it really, if we're just here, we can be missing out on where the work really needs to be done, which is down in parts or over in the problem or kind of in the parts problem zone, if you want to think of it that way, the problems that our parts are carrying. So as valuable as spiritual and transpersonal approaches is, if you're only doing that, you may be missing out. So another point of view on this. Okay, so here's an interesting one. What about from, say, a recreational psychedelic use standpoint, or say from a kind of standard, I don't know how to deal with my issues, so I'm just going to be in avoidance and coping mechanisms kind of standpoint? Where does that put people? So these might sound different, but I actually think they kind of put people in a similar place, right? So I would say for someone who's using recreational psychedelics, it's going to put you somewhere probably over here, right? So somewhere between dead center and fully resourced. In other words, you'll have insights, you'll have, positive emotions, you'll have some novelty, you'll have some fun, you'll feel full of energy, you'll feel playful, you'll feel good, but you're not necessarily, in my experience with recreational psychedelic use, really going to go deep into the transpersonal unless you do a big dose and you kind of intend to, and then that kind of can push you over here somewhere. Or sometimes this can kind of bring you down into parts on a recreational level, and that can even just be kind of interesting where you're playing with different aspects of your persona. Like sometimes with recreational psychedelic use in parts, we see people who get really into, for example, cosplay or makeup or dress or fashion to change the way they look and the way they express, or people who kind of do social experiments to kind of play with how they're coming across publicly. I can think of, for example, someone I knew, back in my raver days, who I had met, some months previously, and she had spent months pretending to be, I think, I want to say from Sweden or a Scandinavian country, Germany, Northern Europe, kind of that area. She had some sort of an accent that kind of implied that. And then one day, I was talking to her at a rave, and she had a Chicago accent, and she's from America, and she's from Chicago. And I was like, "What's this?" And she's like, "No, I was just messing around. I was just playing." So this can happen where we're recreationally playing with parts, right? We're playing with identity or playing with different aspects of ourself. And, fashion can be an interesting way that people do that. There's a lot of other ways people do that, lifestyle stuff. So that can kind of put you here, right? I would say similarly, avoidance, right? When we are, for example, distracting ourselves with consumerism and too much internet use and porn and junk food and video games and media and social media and going out all the time and having some sort of a busy lifestyle. A lot of that is really an attempt to put ourselves towards a resource, but it's not a really robust resource. Usually those are all like fundamentally dopamine seeking behaviors that are really about feeling engaged and stimulated, because when we're engaged and we're stimulated, we are not, our nervous system is so busy with that we are not really over here in dealing with a problem, right? So for a lot of people, it's kind of this area here. It's not an extreme resource like bliss or joy or profound meaning, that we might find over at like the deep end of the resources, but it's somewhere around here where, I'm using caffeine and alcohol and nights out and good food and blah, 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 or time on the internet, to distract myself, right? So it's kind of a low level form of trying to resource yourself to feel better, to get through life, which makes sense if we don't know really, again, how to work with our parts or go towards a problem and process effectively whatever might be all over in this area here. So again, that's kind of what I think of when I think of kind of avoidant behavior or kind of, recreational psychedelic use, and, probably more broadly recreational substance use in general. Generally, we're trying to get some sort of a resourced experience, but it's usually kind of a less resourced than the deep resources of like real profound connection. Okay, so what about in the context of psychedelic therapy, right? So this is really why I made this map in the first place, was to start to map out what I need to know, or what I need to draw from in a support session where I'm working with someone who's taken a psychedelic, right? So the obvious thing that happens here is when people take psychedelics, it can hit them in a variety of different ways. It can really feel very differently, and our nervous system can respond unpredictably and differently every time we take the medicine, and we don't know where that's going to put us, right? So this is, and even obviously in the duration of a journey, you can start at one place and end in a very different place. And so this is one of the problems with working with psychedelics for mental health, is that, you take the medicine and whatever it wants to bring up from your unconscious, it could put you in any place on this map. And so we need some understanding of what's showing up and an understanding of how to be flexible in terms of where to go, right? So this is why I started to organize these different techniques and approaches. I have a different version of this model that I'm not showing you here, where it's got a listing of all the different kind of therapy modalities that I know, and kind of where I would sort them or how I think of them. But if you just think broadly, okay, someone takes some mushrooms, it hits them in an interesting way, and they start to have, information bubbling up through their nervous system from the unconscious to the conscious. And oops, that can end up, let's zoom back in here. Sorry about that, folks. And that can end up, let's say someone ends up boom, like not expecting, they've been feeling fine, they've been feeling normal. Suddenly they had this problem just pops up. There's just a lot of negative emotion. They're really struggling with something. Or often what happens is they take mushrooms and all of a sudden parts want to start bubbling up, different fears, needs, different ages, different aspects of our experience, trying to integrate different parts of our experience. That can really pop up, right? But just as possible, someone takes mushrooms and boom, they have an ego death. They have a transpersonal experience, right? Or they end up, in absolute bliss and gratitude and a wide open heart and a sense of compassion for all of life, right? Or they end up with some sort of an insight, some sort of a reframe that's, kind of a theme or an ongoing thing that their nervous system is processing that's about something they need to process parts and help relieve any issues that a part has. So you can see how, from my point of view at least, as a someone working with people, around psychedelics, you want to have all of these skills in place because you really have no idea where their nervous system is going to want to go until the medicine is in their system. And at that point, obviously, there's no getting off the ride. There's no undoing the medicine. So at that point, it's really about adapting and working with wherever the system wants to go. So that's why I made this map in the first place. And this is really helpful in terms of understanding A, where you end up, and also B, maybe what you need, right? So maybe if you're doing a lot of part stuff, you're processing a lot of parts and memories and aspects of your psyche, maybe it'd be really useful at some point in that medicine journey to take a break and do a process and relax and drop into a more mindful, transpersonal kind of state, right? Let's say you end up really feeling resourced. You have a lot of optimism and hope and strength and renewal and gratitude and well-being. That might be the perfect thing to then start to take and reflect on problems you've been dealing with in your life, things you've been sorting through and wanting to work out, right? Other way around. Let's say you kind of take the medicine and it takes you right into some problem that needs processing, and there's a lot of fear or grief or overwhelm or confusion or struggle or what have you. Perhaps you process that stuff for a while, and then you intentionally take a moment to take a big, deep breath and relax and move yourself over towards a resource state of perhaps gratitude or, compassion or love, right? So again, this can be a really helpful tool, both in terms of understanding where you are and perhaps what might be balancing or healing or useful in terms of ways that you can kind of steer the nervous system in a session to, get some sort of a result that might be really helpful. So that's kind of how I think of this in terms of psychedelic therapy. It's really important as someone working with psychedelics, whether you're a guide or a sitter or an outright therapist, right? Or you're kind of an underground guide, or someone like me who's kind of a coach. It's really important if you're working with people in any capacity around psychedelics that you have this kind of flexibility and this kind of well-roundedness in your training, right? So let me speak to that really quick and then we'll kind of wrap the video here. And this kind of leads me to my last point that I want to convey about this map. For now, again, this is a tool I'll probably be using more on the channel here. I'm sure you'll see more of it. You'll see different examples where I kind of add more content to it. But I just want to kind of show you the basics of this today. The last point that I want to make about this is that, in my opinion, a coach, a therapist, a hypnotherapist, again, an underground guide, a sitter, anyone working with you in any real capacity, I feel like should have a well-rounded toolkit of skills and approaches to interacting with you that covers kind of these four directions and kind of the in-betweens of these four directions. And in my experience, and granted, I'm biased, I've spent years cross-studying and cross-training different modalities. That can get very expensive, and that can be something that if someone perhaps is very busy, for example, as a therapist or as a coach, they may not have the time to really go into a whole other modality or approach to working with people and get more well-rounded. But I really feel like if someone doesn't have the flexibility, then how can they meet your nervous system when it wants to go in one of these directions, right? So if someone isn't well-rounded, then they're going to be very limited in their capacity to meet you depending on where you end up going, whether or not we're talking medicine or just in a standard kind of coaching, therapeutic, working with you kind of context. A lot of the breakdowns that I see where, you know, change workers, you know, support people end up underserving their clients is that they don't have the tools to match where their client wants to go. So, and again, that's not even where the client wants to go consciously. It's where the client wants to go unconsciously, where their nervous system is drawn, right? So someone who's really good at spiritual work may really suck at having good models and understanding of psychology and issues and therapy and how to work with that stuff. Someone who's really good at, you know, positive emotions and, you know, inspiring you and empowering you, again, may really suck at working with problems, or may not. If you want to go spiritual, all of a sudden they don't have a framework for that. They have no reference experiences. They've never gone deep into their own spirituality, right? Or someone who's really good at IFS may suck at, you know, resourcing you or at doing transpersonal work, or et cetera, right? And so I would just offer you the idea, that anyone you're working with ideally would be well-rounded and able to be flexible with you, because your nervous system, you know, as a human being is multifaceted, has a lot of different sides and parts to you as a person and your lived experience. And I think that requires a certain amount of ability to meet the client wherever they are and go wherever your nervous system needs to go to be met and seen and connected and honored and understood, right? I would also say that, again, this map is something for you to look at in terms of, you know, where do you spend your time? Where's your center of gravity? What do you need more of, right? What are you lacking on this map? You know, do you spend a lot of time kind of bypassing problems and working on personal self-help stuff, but you're still stuck with your trauma patterns? Or somebody who's really spiritual, but lacks perhaps some of the fidelity and the, you know, detail of parts work? Are you someone who's really like deep in the ruminating on parts work and issues and perhaps needs to spend more time cultivating a resourced sense of self or transpersonal experience, right? That's kind of why I made this, to kind of give us more, again, of a big picture sense of where we are and perhaps where we need to go. So that's it on this. I'm just going to kind of sum this up really quick and we'll wrap the video. So that's the model. So I'd be curious to know, what do you think? Is this useful for you? Did I say something here that kind of struck a chord or got you to think in a new way? Does this help you to know perhaps where you need to go or what you need to do next in your healing path, or perhaps places where you're a little underdeveloped or deficient in your healing path? Does this help you to know better what to look for in a guide or in a therapist, right? I'd be curious. So leave a comment down below. And we're going to wrap the video for now, because surely it's already been a long watch. Thank you for hanging in there if you watched the whole thing. And if you have any questions, disagreements, commentary, anything like that, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment down below. And until next time, take care. Much love to you all, and I'll see you soon.